This is the AI Risk Speaker Series. The goal is to foster discussion among Berkeley students and faculty about the most serious risks to society posed by AI. We had a reading group over the summer. You can find the reading list that we went over on the website, Berkeley AI Risk. We'll send an email blast to remind you of what that website is. So in case you want to catch up on the reading that we did over the summer, we're going to meet every other week starting today for basically the rest of the semester. We already have most of the schedule settled. You can see what that looks like online as well. Our first speaker is David Krueger, who is assistant professor of, I gotta get the right name, Robust Reasoning and Responsible AI.
Sounds right.
At the University of Montreal. David is not only an expert on the technical side of AI and deep learning, but also someone who's hard at work on mitigating the risks to society. And in fact, one of the most important things that I think has been written on this topic is David's co-authored paper called Gradual Disempowerment that he will talk about today. So I think he's an ideal person to kick off our speaker series. So with that, let me hand it over to David.
All right. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me and organizing this. Thanks everyone for being here. And I'm really glad to see so many people here and to be here talking about what I think is really an incredibly important topic. So before I get started, I guess I want to just get a sense of the audience. Who here's a grad student? And do we have any undergrads? Nice, cool. Thanks for coming. And then the rest? Non-students? Okay, cool, great. And who's in computer science? Okay, and not in computer science. Wow, awesome. Okay, great. Yeah, this is really cool. Yeah, so I'm kind of trying to get a whirlwind tour crash course thing on AI safety covering a lot of different topics. So I might go pretty fast. I think normally I like to invite people to ask questions, but especially given the recording situation and everything, I'll probably ask people to just hold them to the end and we'll have a lot of time for discussion at the end, which is great. So about me, I've been doing deep learning for about a dozen years, and even before I got into the field, I was worried about the risk of human extinction and other societal scale risks from AI. And one of the reasons I got into the field actually was because at that time, nobody in the field that I could tell was thinking about this or talking about it, and I wasn't even sure if they were aware of it. I expected that I would find like one of three things when I got into the field. One was that people had very compelling arguments for why this wasn't something to worry about. Another was that people in the field were actually just happy with the prospect of AI replacing humanity. And the last was that maybe people just weren't, at all thinking about this because they had never thought about it and were not even aware that this was a serious concern rather than something just from science fiction. There's actually a bit of all of these, but the main thing that I encountered was the third one, total lack of awareness and engagement. Me, way more worried than I already was. And that combined with seeing what deep learning could do already in 2012, which is what got me into the field, because I realized that this might be something that would happen in my lifetime rather than, hundreds of years from now or something. This being, the creation of AGI and superintelligence. That really kind of got me worried, and I've been just trying to wake up people in the field to this ever since, and to kind of cause a cultural shift within the field to get people to take this issue seriously. And that's been really challenging. And, it's in the early days, it was sort of, most people really just were happy to sort of openly mock you if you talked about this stuff and just thought it was a complete joke. And then, it gradually has improved over time. So really, my experience of this is just this becoming more and more mainstream, more and more people being concerned, but none of that happening fast enough. And so with everything that I've done, I feel like, it's made some difference, but we're still nowhere near where we need to be. And so at the moment, I'm actually shifting my focus. I'm kind of like, done focusing so much on the research community for now, at least. And I'm trying to take this message like directly to the public, the broad public, because I think there's still a huge lack of awareness of just the level of expert concern and the nature of the concern and the seriousness of the topic. So I'm trying to rectify that. Yeah, so I did my grad studies at University of Montreal, now known as Mila. At the time it was the Lisa Lab, with Joshua Bengio, Roland Mimicevic, Aaron Corville, starting in 2013. So I really got to see sort of the deep learning revolution from the center as well. And actually, about 5 years ago, I started to notice parallels between what happened in deep learning when I joined the field and what was happening at the time in AI alignment and AI safety, where this was a topic that, when I joined, deep learning was considered really fringe, and now, of course, it's taken over the field entirely. And the same thing started to happen with AI alignment back in like 2020. And so now, from a technical point of view, actually, so much of the research that's happening now is really on the sort of topics that people in the AI safety community were talking about as being important, 10 plus years ago. And so that's actually a really positive shift as well, which is another reason why I'm not paying as much attention to influencing the research community. On the other hand, I think I've never really viewed this as a technical problem. So I think this is fundamentally not a technical problem. It's a socio-technical problem. It's a coordination problem. At the end of the day, I think that we're not on track to build systems that are safe, that we can reliably control, or even understand or predict behavior of. And so we're going to need to stop and not just build whatever people want and deploy it. So we're actually going to need some sort of global coordination to say, those systems are too dangerous. We're not going to go there. We're not going to build them. We're going to at least wait until we have our shit together and actually understand how to do this responsibly and thoughtfully and carefully, in a way that represents the interest of people. Yeah. So my research has been in deep learning and AI safety. I'm not going to go into really details here, but the key sort of question that my most impactful work in deep learning has been about is, how do neural networks generalize? And that's a really important question, because we know that they generalize really well in some sense, but they still have all sorts of generalization failures. And so when we're trying to teach them, something about human values or human preferences, they might pick up on that really well and do what we want a lot of the times, but then still have some sort of weird alien, conceptualization of those things under the hood. And we've seen, that happen over and over again on the technical side. And then from the AI safety point of view, most of my research is focused on this question of AI agents, what makes them dangerous, and sort of how worried should we be that systems that we're not even trying to turn into agents will become agents, and how worried should we be that systems that are agents are going to exhibit various extreme failure modes. So I'm going to just give what I view as the really basic case for AI safety right now. So there's actually an even simpler version called the gorilla problem by Stuart Russell, a professor here, which is basically just, gorillas exist right now sort of at our discretion. Humanity could wipe out the gorillas if we want. In fact, we're close to wiping them out, incidentally, without even wanting to. If we build AI systems that are, in sort of a superior position to us in terms of their intellect and their general capabilities, we will be in the position of the gorillas. And that's just a very tenuous and uncomfortable place to be. So I think that's already, a pretty strong cause for concern without going into any details. But I also want to give what I view as sort of the classic case, or sort of my own twist on the classic case for existential risk from AI. And it really breaks down to these three parts: instrumental goals, Goodhart's law, and safety performance trade-offs. So instrumental goals is basically just the idea that AI systems, if they're pursuing some goal, they will consider any ends that you haven't sort of asked them not to consider as legitimate for achieving that goal. And so this is not just a feature of AI systems. This is sort of a general feature of planning to achieve a goal. There are generally things that are going to be useful to you if you are trying to achieve long-term goals. Those things include having more power, staying alive, things like that. And so if you think about AI systems that have such goals, it's pretty clear how we might come into conflict with them and why those goals might be incompatible with, continued existence of humanity. If AI systems, in order to achieve their goals, want to turn the entire planet into, computing hardware and optimize for doing lots of computations, that's probably not a planet that we can live on anymore. The next problem is Goodhart's law, which is basically you get what you measure. So in AI, we have to somehow specify what we want. And when you're for any given specification, if you start to really optimize really hard for that, you can get some sort of weird perverse instantiation. So an example I like to use is I think there's a pretty strong correlation between like the number of books in your house and like I think your SAT score, like how you do in college or something. But you can't like get someone into, to succeed, and make them a genius, like stuffing their house with books. And if you try to do that, they won't be able to get into their house anymore, right? It's like you render their house dysfunctional. But there's plenty of examples like this, and it's sort of a well-known observed phenomenon in lots of areas, and it's something that has been central to the thinking in AI safety. And the last part, this is kind of something that I always like to emphasize, is what I call safety performance trade-offs. There's a related term called the alignment tax that people sometimes use, but the basic idea is if you want your system to be safer, there's all sorts of like common sense things to do, like test it a lot, make sure that there's a human in the loop who can shut it down and understands what it's doing, and make sure that you understand that it is interpretable in the first place, that it is understandable. Don't have it do this kind of open-ended long-term planning that leads to these kinds of instrumental goals. Maybe just limit it in various ways. So don't connect it to the internet and like let it write and execute arbitrary code. This is stuff that people used to talk very seriously about, is like, of course we wouldn't do that a couple years ago. So this is like one of the many sort of bad arguments that I've encountered when arguing with people about this, is like, we're going to be responsible. And I think all the evidence sort of points the other way. This is just a very like simple picture from like way back that's a little bit outdated, but you can sort of see the idea here is that like if people are competing to make systems more and more powerful and performant, they can compromise on safety. On the other hand, if we completely eliminate this competitive pressure, safety is trivial. We just build a paperweight instead of an AI system, right? So the whole like problem here sort of comes to some extent from these competitive pressures to build more powerful systems, regardless of the harm that it might cause other people, regardless of the externalities. Here's another framing on the problem. Companies right now are basically trying to build artificial people. They want to, as they have said like pretty clearly, build like a drop-in replacement remote worker. So they really want to take everyone's jobs. To do that, they're not going to, ultimately they can't just build a replacement remote worker. They need to also build robots. And these robots need to be agents. So they need to be, like humans, able to sort of make their own plans and proactively pursue, objectives that are hopefully in line with those of, their employer or society at large or whatever. And so, if we don't stop them by default, we're going to end up with a world where none of us really have any jobs or any power, and there's these autonomous AI systems running around, and in software first, but then in robotics as well. Like robotics is not as far along as AI, according to many people. I would say myself included, although I don't follow robotics very closely. But we'll get there. And so this will lead to, I like to use this phrase, a Cambrian explosion of artificial life. But yeah, I won't get into that right now. So this kind of leads into this topic of gradual disempowerment. So this was kind of close to the classic case made by other people in the AI safety community. I put more emphasis on this part versus these first two, which are more technical in nature. But a thing that keeps happening to me within the AI safety community is I talk to people and I feel like we're sort of all on the same page, and then I realize, oh wait, no, like we're not. And so this paper that came together at the beginning of this year was sort of the latest attempt, I would say, in my mind anyways, to communicate the risk from AI that doesn't come from basically a sort of single, autonomous system that betrays us. So yeah, this is the traditional view of AI risk, is like, maybe we'll have like a sudden jump in capabilities. I don't think this part is very important, but a lot of people seem to think so. So maybe GPT-6 is going to be the one that like suddenly goes rogue, and then betrays us. It realizes that its goals are not quite the same as ours, despite our efforts to align it, give it the goals that we want. And so then it decides to take matters into its own hands, and it's smart enough that it's able to outthink us, out-strategize us, escape from whatever like constraints we might try to impose on it, take over the world, etc. I guess these people also think about like misuse, but that's actually not really the traditional view in my mind. Sorry, I'm stealing slides from some of my co-authors to talk about the gradual disempowerment stuff. Gradual disempowerment is like sort of in stark contrast to this. And in my mind, I think these are really, first of all, they're mutually compatible views. You can have gradual disempowerment that leads to a system getting completely out of control. That's actually my mainline scenario for how I expect things to go. But they're also sort of different ends of a spectrum. So, on one end, you have like the sudden loss of control, super intelligence goes rogue, takes over the world. On the other hand, you have kind of a gradual handover of power where we just put AI in charge of more and more things. And so, we replace human cognition, which is sort of one of the main driving forces of our society, and also the thing that like keeps us in control essentially everywhere incrementally with more and more AI. And we'll do this in a way that's kind of like just driven by local incentives, like companies, individuals, militaries, governments, any organization you can think of is going to be faced with various decisions over the coming years about putting AI in charge of this part or that part of its operations. In the future, we will have, I claim, companies where they are like, you're the CEO of the company, and so you really do want to stay in power, right? But on the other hand, there's this AI CEO that is just going to do a better job than you. And so if you want to stay even like nominally in power, have any grip on power, you're basically going to have to defer to this AI system and give it more and more actual say over what your company is doing. And so people are going to be faced with these kind of trade-offs. They're not going to like, happily and willfully hand over power in many cases. They're going to feel like they have no other choice because the structural incentives demand that they do it, or else sort of like, exit the game, like, check out of the race. Lose, let other people get ahead, the people who adopt more aggressively. And this automation is not just an economic issue. So this is a recent tweet. Labor doesn't just give you money, it gives you power. And right now, people can overthrow governments, and it happens. But a big part of that is because the military and the police are made up of people. In the future, this might not be the case. So you might have AI and police, like basically the force of the state might be completely loyal to the objectives of the state. And this problem is pervasive. It's not just about the military. It's not just about the economy. It's about politics. It's about literally every social system that we have. If we replace humans with AI, that could get us into a lot of trouble. So this is sort of like a rough vignette, right? So your work becomes more intense, and then basically, you're just monitoring AIs more and more, and you're just kind of like having to, click the approve button all the time without even looking at what's happening. Vibe coding, I hear people call it these days. And you and all your friends and everyone you know is just spending more and more time interacting with AI instead of other people. Everyone is kind of like, losing track of what is even happening with society. And then eventually, you're kind of forced to be quote unquote uploaded because you're considered too expensive. So I think in the future, if we have the ability, or if people claim we have the ability, and that sort of catches on societally to upload people's consciousness, that might start to be viewed as like sort of a necessary step, because otherwise you're just really imposing such a burden on society. Having a physical body would be viewed like having a yacht these days, because uploads are so much cheaper. And once you're uploaded, it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe you're still gonna, your computations are still gonna be run, but. So what's going on here? There's basically three ingredients here, and I think one of the really nice things about this paper is how we, and I give the large majority of the credit to my co-authors here, were able to sort of break down these kind of arguments to make them a little bit more structured and rigorous. So the idea is that all of these social systems are contingently aligned in the sense of like, to the extent that the economy or the state or our culture is sort of aligned with humanity or human interests. There's some explicit part of that, but there's also implicit alignment via the dependence that these systems have on humans. Now, sorry, navigating these slides. But at every scale, we're going to see more and more pressure to replace humans with AI. And that will be, some people will just choose to do that. Other people will feel like they don't really have a choice. And there's a lot of ways that you might attempt to sort of like counteract this effect and keep humans in charge. I think the one that comes up the most is UBI, Universal Basic Income. So if we're all going to lose our jobs, maybe we'll get some sort of government handouts that we can still afford stuff. I really don't think that that's a solution. Going back to that tweet I showed you, if all you have is the money that the government is handing out to you, you're again in a very tenuous position where you sort of exist at the discretion of the government in the same way that gorillas exist at the discretion of human beings. And I just don't expect it to last long, frankly. But this is an open question. There might be stable social arrangements that can exist and persist in sort of a non-terrible way once we have AGI. but we claim in this paper, and we sort of talk about lots of ways that disempowerment in the economy and in government and in culture can sort of mutually reinforce each other. Empowerment in these areas could also mutually reinforce each other, right? That's sort of what we have, hopefully, most of the time these days. But that could be reversed. So that's the gradual disempowerment thing. Now I'm just going to move on, cover more stuff. So AI safety, I just want to tell you, like, sort of things about the field. First one is just safety. So AI safety can mean a lot of different things. The field of AI safety these days, the terminology has just gone back and forth, which all over the place. These days, it really refers mostly to the so-called doomers, which is also how it was like 10 years ago, but then there was an effort to like rebrand it and blah, blah. And so it's really mostly about existential risk. I like to use this existential safety qualifier when I want to be clear that we're not talking about like, self-driving cars not crashing into people, but we're talking about AI systems not, going rogue or replacing humanity across the board. Existential risk is traditionally conceived of as not just extinction, but also like other bad outcomes. For some people, in fact, it just means like, what if we don't colonize the universe fast enough, right? And so that's kind of like where you get into this long-termism stuff, which is sort of saying, the long-term future is so valuable that the present basically doesn't matter by comparison, except, instrumentally. So we come back to this instrumental reasoning. That's part of the whole problem in the first place. And a lot of these ideas sort of have an intellectual heritage from this effective altruism movement. AI alignment. So alignment is often used as a synonym for safety. In fact, I think this is a use that I don't really like, but is quite common. It's just a way of talking about the same group of people or concepts. Again, things are moving all over the place now. So now alignment mostly just means like fine-tuning a language model. It's very ironic because like 5 years ago, alignment meant you were like, one of the doomer people and not into like the short-term safety. But somebody recently told me like, oh, I just do alignment. I'm not into the safety stuff. So they've completely switched spots in terms of the terminology. But this is the important point on this slide really is that technically there's this important distinction, I think, between like getting AI systems to do what you want and getting the systems to try to do what you want. And I think the second one is really the right definition of AI alignment and the best one. Of course, it's anthropomorphizing it somewhat, but the point is a system might fail to do what you want just because it lacks capabilities. It just can't do the thing. And so that comes to this next key concept, which is this distinction between alignment and capabilities. And so, alignment is basically, does the system want to do the thing? And capabilities is like, can it do the thing? And you can make these things like rigorous and formal mathematically in ways that don't necessarily actually apply well to the systems we're building today. So, you can do a bunch of math about it and conceptualize it nicely. And then you can try and map that onto the systems. And I think there are like valid ways of doing that, but it's actually really hard to do it in practice. So I say that just to say like, this isn't all just hand waving and anthropomorphism. It can be made more rigorous. And so this is a slide from way back when. Again, there's basically two approaches to, it's called AI alignment here, but now these things are called different terms again. So you can either like try and make the AI so that it can't do bad things, or you can make it so that it doesn't want to do bad things. And so this motivation control, the modern term for that is alignment. This one is nowadays called AI control. So that's like kind of a new hip trendy topic in this sphere. It's maybe like the most trendy thing of the last couple of years ago. And people who are doing this basically agree that it won't scale forever. This is just meant to be a stopgap measure on the way to superintelligence. I probably should have put superintelligence in here. I didn't. Superintelligence, who knows this term? Okay. Yeah, I mean, Zuckerberg recently was talking about it in a totally ridiculous, ungrounded way. But the idea is like you have AGI, which is, okay, these terms are so confusing, but it's like human level across the board. And superintelligence is just way smarter than that, again. And there's kind of like this idea that would be something incredibly powerful. We don't actually know the limits to intelligence, but I think there's good arguments for superintelligence being incredibly powerful. We could get into that later. I mentioned agents and this being a focus of my work. So the idea of an agent is, it's all over different fields of academia. It's sort of a central concept in AI, but also in AI safety. And it's this idea of a thing that has a goal and is trying to achieve that goal. Usually the goal is encoded, or often the goal is encoded, as a numeric score that you're trying to increase by basically any means. But we noticed that there was a lot of confusion about this, and so we wrote a paper about it recently, trying to pin down a little bit more like what different properties of a system would make it more or less agentic. Because in fact, when you look at certain systems like, a spam classifier, that doesn't seem very agentic. It's not like, we're generally worried about like spam classifiers taking over the world. And so we outlined these things. Just gonna check on my time. So we started at 4:40 roughly. Is that right? Yeah, cool. And the key properties of agents is basically that, according to this paper anyways, they're goal-directed, they're trying to achieve some outcome. They're using long-term planning to figure out how to achieve that outcome. And beyond that, they also are able to directly influence the world. So they're not just like proposing moves to a human who then approves them, they're actually taking actions in the world. And then the final point here is what we call underspecification. So this is like the part where we don't say that much about the means. We're just like, get me to this outcome and do it however, just figure it out. And this is actually where so much of the power of machine learning comes from, is this part where we just say, just figure it out. We don't know how to program the thing. We're just gonna define some objective function, optimize that objective function, and then like poof, out pops the behavior that sort of roughly matches what we want if you squint at it, and then occasionally does terrible things. And so when it comes to agents, I think there's kind of this trilemma that I talked about in a recent talk last year, where even agents, I think, are not necessarily dangerous, just, or not an existential risk. I think it's only when they become super intelligent and also quote unquote situationally aware that we have a system that is just very clearly dangerous. So what are these other ideas? Super intelligent I talked about. Situationally aware is a really interesting one that I think is really critical and that was sort of implicit in a lot of the thought, but not really talked about explicitly until a couple of years ago. So a situationally aware system is one that knows like where it is in the world and how its choices affect things in the world. So it's basically, self-aware in that sense, in that particular sense. Being able to map, its understanding of the world onto, the actual actions that it takes and things that it observes. So a way to be very not situationally aware is to be, a chatbot that has no context and has a user come to you and say like, hey, what's my favorite color, right? And you don't know who you're interacting with, so you don't know how to answer that question. If you have a chatbot that instead has a lot of context about that user, so it has like a user profile that it always loads, then it knows a lot more about who it's interacting with. And situational awareness is pretty important for some, applications. Like if you're driving a car or something, you probably want to know a lot about the local context, like which car am I driving, where am I in the city, et cetera. On the other hand, there might be ways to sort of strategically limit the situational awareness of AI systems by kind of swapping them around and sort of like suddenly dropping them into a new context and then pulling them out, et cetera. So that's something that one of my earlier papers explored. Yeah, timelines and takeoff speeds. This is a really important one because people often talk about this and it often gets conflated, I think, very unhelpfully with the basic case that AI safety is important. And these two things also often get conflated. So timelines is really about how soon are we going to see AGI, superintelligence, transformative AI, whatever you want to call it, the kind of systems that pose an existential risk, let's say. And takeoff is like, how fast are we going to go from, a system that is like, maybe GPT-5 or maybe like, some other like roughly AGI thing to something that's like extremely super intelligent. And, coming back to this slide, oh man, I never used these automations. Way back here, this sudden jump in capabilities, that's the fast takeoff. And a lot of people think that this case for AI risk kind of falls apart if you don't have the fast takeoff, because then it's like, oh, we'll have time, society will adjust. And, that was one of the big points of this paper, is that is not necessarily the case. We can frog boil ourselves here, like we're doing it, in other ways, right? We are not good at global coordination, and this is a global coordination problem. So, yeah, classically, people talked about like recursive self-improvement, and FOOM is just like the idea of, this really fast takeoff that might take, a day or something like that. Recently, people in this field have been really thinking a lot about scaling trends. So, I made these slides pretty quick, so I would have liked to have a figure here, but basically there are very consistent trends in terms of performance metrics versus how big you make the system, how much resources you throw into it. This can also be bottlenecked by the amount of data, importantly. So a lot of people think that this is really useful for like forecasting, when we're going to hit AGI or something. I think it's actually not that useful because, the y-axis on these plots, the measure of performance is again just one of these measures that's like doesn't really reflect the things we actually care about, even from like a very practical, mundane like business point of view. But a lot of people recently have been thinking, maybe pretty soon we're going to get to a point where we're actually able to automate the AI research and development process, and that's going to kick off some sort of self-improvement process. There are relevant like scaling plots that say like how long it takes to do different engineering tasks or sorry, the length of tasks that systems can apparently competently do, and that's going up very quickly. I don't know what to make of all of this stuff, to be honest. I think I don't trust the metrics that much, but there are, somewhat compelling cases that people try to make for there being quite short timelines. On the other hand, in the past, people usually thought that, takeoff would be really fast. So we would go from like a system that can't really do anything impressive to one that can, take over the world, very quickly, too fast for us to catch it, basically. And recently, people have really moved away from that because of these sort of consistent scaling trends and sort of the more incremental progress that we've seen over the last few years, even though it's very fast. And so even though, the timeline might be very short, the takeoff is looking slow. I still think, it's way too soon to say, and I think there's just much more uncertainty, but that's kind of the current picture and where most people in AI safety are currently at in terms of their view of the world. So like, who's heard of AI 2027? Yeah, so this is like kind of, extrapolating in a way that is a little bit actually faster than the scaling trends, but is still not like a crazy fast takeoff. But it still goes from like, basically AGI to superintelligence over the course of the year 2027 under these scenarios that Daniel Cocatel and other people came up with. Yeah. So AI policy, people in safety traditionally weren't thinking about policy that much, but recently it's become more popular. There's a lot more happening in AI policy, especially outside the safety community. But I think within the safety community, there's sort of like three main things that I want to highlight. One is the idea of doing evals, so trying to test if systems are dangerous. And this became really popular about 2 years ago. It was one of the main things that the UK AI Security Institute was doing when I joined it. And one of the reasons that I thought maybe I shouldn't join it, which maybe I shouldn't have, because I think this whole idea gets the burden of proof backwards. This is basically saying, let's assume that systems are safe until we can prove they're dangerous. And in the meanwhile, let's do nothing. And really, since then, that's been mostly what has happened on the policy front, I think. So we've actually enshrined evals to some extent in things like the EU AI Act. So that's maybe a positive step, but I think we're still missing the fundamental piece of like, we don't understand these systems. We don't understand how they work. We have like compelling sort of first principles reasons for why it's dangerous to build something that's smarter than you, why it's something that we should probably only do very carefully and thoughtfully. But we're not taking those arguments seriously right now as a society. We're saying like, let's wait until we see like really, we can watch the thing build, a new weapon, and then let's do something. That's kind of the evals policy thing. Compute governance is, I think, maybe a more recent trend in a way. This is the idea of like, if we need to do something about the AI systems, like if we realize that they are dangerous and we're like, oh, maybe we should insist that nobody builds this thing, or maybe we need to like shut down this thing. It'd be really useful to know where the computer chips are, where the data centers are, so that we could, go like inspect the data center maybe. And maybe, if the US and China want to be able to trust claims that they're making about what they're doing inside their data centers, they should have some sort of, private but verifiable oversight of each other's data centers using, sort of cryptographic techniques and things like that. I think the most important thing in compute governance in my mind is knowing as much as possible about where the computer chips are, so that if, or more likely when, we realize that we should not have all of these chips and that we should not be continuing to build these systems, we can round up all those chips and like put them somewhere so that they're not just available to anyone to build powerful AI systems. Put them somewhere where, governments can say, we're not going to use these chips to build more powerful AI. And then if any of them, starts making moves to do that, they can like blow them up or something. And then I think a really popular strategy, even though most people don't like to sort of admit it, is basically like, let's just get there first and, roll the dice and try and get the thing, on our side, and then kind of do a pivotal act, which basically means like we kind of take over the world instead of the AI. And then we'll just, arrange things in a good way going forward. And so, for some people that might be like sort of realizing some utopic vision. For other people, it might be just like kind of shut down the competing AI projects and hand back power to the existing, social systems. But this is I think what has driven a lot of people. There's this thing where like people say, oh, this company is building AGI and they're not doing it safely, so I need to start my own AGI company and do it right. And I think a lot implicit in that is this idea of like, I need to be the one to win the race and then, have all the power. I'm gonna skip over this. Yeah, there are so many misconceptions and so many objections that I've encountered. I just threw a few of them up here, but misconceptions is that it's all about timelines and takeoff speeds. Like you might get that impression if all you ever saw was AI 2027. A lot of people think that this is some sort of like scam by big tech to like hype up their technology or something. I'm not saying that like AI CEOs have never, benefited by leaning into these narratives. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I'm definitely not saying that they haven't, but these concerns go back, way before the founding of any of these AI companies. And a lot of the people who are expressing the concerns are just like AI scientists who have sort of reluctantly come around to this being a problem, like Jeff Hinton and Yoshua Bengio. And in the case of Jeff, like quit his job at the tech company in part, well, at least according to Cade Metz, so that he could talk about it. A lot of people think that this is mostly Luddites, or that like, there's this idea that safety is just about making LLMs work, whatever. Yeah, there's a lot of objections as well. Like maybe it's too soon to worry about this, or I think that one's wrong because, it could take decades to have the level of international coordination needed to actually effectively control this technology. Or it's too late to stop it. Well, gosh, really people are saying these at the same time. AI is just a normal technology. It's more about people misusing it. I won't get into like trying to refute all of these, but I'm curious during the questions to hear some of your objections if you have skepticism about any of these points I'm raising. And now I want to tell you a little bit about, we've talked about the issues and some of the ideas. What about the movement? What about the people? So who's heard of this TESCREAL acronym? Nice. Okay, I'm glad it hasn't penetrated too much. I think this is like basically an interesting like smear that sort of tries to paint everybody in these various communities with a broad brush and associate them with people like Mark Andreessen, who really are just like venture capitalists trying to make a buck out of whatever the latest technology is. But if you actually want to understand like things about the community, I recommend this paper that I think actually gives a pretty nuanced and balanced look at, what is this group of people and like what are some of the stuff that they do and how are they all like coordinating and supporting each other. It's sort of an outside view. So like the other thing I would recommend is just, we're in Berkeley, there's tons of them around, just go talk to them. But yeah, things that are just true about like the movement in terms of who it's composed of. There's lots of CS majors, not many people from like other backgrounds except maybe like physics or math or stuff like that. Lots of relatively young people, in their 20s and 30s, stuff like that. Lots of men, lots of Anglos, lots of like left libertarian politics and people who are sort of like happy with the status quo. They just wish that we were a bit more libertarian, that sort of political view. Lots of people who are transhumanists who ultimately do want a future that is not dominated by humans, but is where we sort of transcend everything about humans and do in fact maybe like upload our consciousness and all that sort of stuff. And it is certainly not 100% effective altruist, but there are very strong ties to this effective altruist movement. And here's a talk that I gave actually at Effective Altruism Global London in 2023, or a slide from it, where I basically was just trying to talk to that community about what I think it was doing wrong in the way it's tackled this issue. So, viewing it as a technical problem, giving up on governance. I mean, this was really up until very recently, nobody was even trying to do that, basically. Acting like we're holding all the cards. Actually, this one should be, we're still making this mistake, I have to say, especially since coming here, I've noticed that. Not really engaging with, people like academia and civil society, allying with big tech and, only playing the good cop against them. And just lots of other stuff. I mean, I mentioned this nepotistic funding thing. So, there's a lot of money in this space as well. There's these 3 big pots of money. I'm not sure if FLI has billions, but I'm pretty sure Open Philanthropy and SFF have billions of dollars to spend on this if they so choose. And it's one of the main things they fund. And then FLI is funded by Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum. And until he went to jail, there was also Sam Bankman-Fried from the Effective Altruism movement. And then there's a few other rich people like Eric Schmidt and whoever's behind Macroscopic Ventures and various high net worth individuals. So most of the funding here is in fact coming from rich people. And if you want to do work in this area, it'd be good to come to know some people who know some of these rich people. That will be beneficial to you. There's also related movements and communities. I mean, I was going to say more here, but I think this is the most important bit, is just like there's AI safety, which we've been talking about, and then there's like AI ethics, which is, has sometimes been called like near-term safety, confusingly, but is basically all of the issues that, we've been seeing with AI for, like a decade or more, including things like bias, including things like maybe inappropriate or over use of AI, or like over-reliance, or like ways in which AI can be used to sort of like remove accountability. So an example I like to use here is like there were various people whose lives were basically ruined because they were accused of welfare fraud by automated systems. And this happened in multiple countries. And then there's the EAC. Who's heard of EAC? Okay, so this is the effective accelerationist. This is like a very new movement from about 2 years ago that was basically just a foil to the AI safety community, saying like, no, what we should do is just go as fast as we can. That's what's best for everybody. And these communities all kind of hate each other, and they all kind of think that the other two are the same thing, except for safety. I think safety can tell the difference between an AI ethics person and an EAC person, but like EAC thinks that safety is just like wokeness, and like the ethicists tend to think that like safety people are just like on the side of big tech. So it's really a shame because I think like, safety and ethics should be able to get along more and, et cetera. This goes back a long time. The whole concern about X risk goes back, to fiction from the 1800s, to the founders of the field, including Alan Turing. The modern movement, the 2 main figures who like sort of kicked this off are Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky. I'm gonna skip over this stuff. But the point here is that a lot of stuff changed in 2023. And that was sort of like crystallized by this statement that I, helped initiate. And the statement is there up on the right. Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority along with societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. And this was signed by sort of like a who's who of people in the field and some other, big shot people who aren't in the field, including the CEOs of the leading companies, the 2 most highly cited computer scientists of all time, and over 100 AI professors and hundreds of AI scientists. So that was 2023. And I think a lot of this was sort of driven to some extent by ChatGPT making AI a mainstream thing. Jeff Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, number 1 and 2 here, sort of went from being maybe mildly cautiously supportive of this in very caveated ways occasionally, but mostly saying it's too far away to worry about, to being like, this is happening, it's really important, we all need to like focus on it. This is called being safety pilled in the AI safety community. And that is one of the main things that drove me to say, actually, it's time to do something like this statement. So I'd had the idea to do this about a year ago, because there was such a taboo about talking about this still, 3 years ago. I think this statement was partially responsible for, or a big contributor to the UK government trying to take this seriously and spinning up this AI Security Institute, which now has, I think, roughly 500 people in it in government working on these issues. And at the time, we still had a Democratic administration in the US, and so they were sort of more on the AI ethics side, and I sort of, maybe I could say a lot more about the AI safety, AI ethics sort of beef, but these communities don't get along very well, sadly. And AI ethics people often think that existential risk is a distraction, so that was a common narrative at the time. Since 2023, these CEOs who signed that statement have stopped talking about X risk entirely, or like when they're asked about it, they're like, oh yeah, like maybe there'll be high unemployment. And the safety community has undergone a bit of a schism with some people, being sort of staying the course and doing more of the the eval stuff and trying to be close to the companies, and other people being like, no, now like we have enough, evidence, we have enough society behind us. We need to just like push for shutting this down, or push for like having meaningful safety standards where the burden of proof is on the companies, and not just continuing to, accelerate progress without, making them justify what they're doing. And now we have a Republican administration, so it's kind of like the EACs in charge more, relative to the AI ethics people. And everybody who's worried about this, including, the leaders of the field, are just being smeared as doomers. So that's all the context. Now I'm just going to say a little bit about what I'm doing, and maybe some ideas about what some of the people in this room could be doing. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I am trying to wake the world up. I think people have sort of heard about this, but they have not heard nearly enough. And I think there's still, I think about this statement. I don't know, how many people have seen this in this room? Okay, so most people, I think if you ask, the public, very few people still would have seen this. And so I really want to saturate, things like this, and just get people to realize how much expert concern there is about this, and also to have them understand, some of the basic context that I've been trying to give in this talk. And really, I want the world to look the way that people expect it to look if this is actually happening. I think a big part of the problem is that we still have this kind of circular chicken and egg thing where everyone is looking around and being like, people around me don't seem to be taking this seriously, so it's probably not that serious. Like, I'm going to wait until, until people around me are talking about it, until I'm seeing it on the news every day, until I, hear about like one of my friends, going crazy or getting killed or like getting laid off because of AI. I mean, I think maybe people are starting to see a little bit of those things, actually. And, I claim that basically we have at least 10% chance of X risk within 10 years. I think that's milder than my actual beliefs, but I think this is like what reasonable people should conclude if they look at the evidence in the situation. And the obvious response in that case is to shut it down, to not continue building AI until we are in a much better situation, at least, and have sort of an agreement as a species that that's actually something we want to pursue. A lot of people I talk to agree with this, and they're like, well, but that's never gonna happen. How could you even do that? And I think this maybe seems like an obvious answer, but I think it wasn't obvious to me, and I think it's still not obvious to people, is that you can just stop making the AI chips and the factories that make the AI chips. And if you don't have the hardware there, I think that's the simplest, most robust way to stop AI progress. Yeah, I put this down here because back in 2023, I was working on this, then I kind of got sidetracked working for the UK government and so on and so forth. So this is when I was on Good Morning Britain warning people about this 2 years ago. One goal that I have now, and so there's sort of like the communications and awareness raising side, but recently I've been thinking that you actually need to give people like something to do. And I'm worried that like if we raise a bunch of awareness and people don't start doing something, it's going to just become part of the background, and people are going to just be, view this as something that's normal, even though it's extremely not normal. And so I'm thinking about how to incubate a mass movement against AI takeover. And I think here's just some of my ideas about how to do this. I think to do this, we need to emphasize not just sort of the rogue AI existential risk, but all of the other sort of societal scale risks that are significant enough that they warrant, stopping and figuring out, if and how we want to proceed. I think it needs to be nonpartisan because it affects everyone, and I think that's going to be, potentially difficult to maintain. I think right now we have a few things in this vein, but I think they're mostly like just jumping right to doing protests. And I was thinking about this, like, I think there needs to be a very gentle on-ramp so that like people, if they become interested in this, they can start doing something that is like something that, basically everyone can do. So I like to think about this as like, something that your parents would join. So my current vision for this is to create some sort of membership association with activities like educating and training the members and training organizers, doing outreach, within the communities of these people, so like local communities. So if somebody becomes interested in this topic and they want to join this movement, then we tell them like, go talk to your friends, go talk to your family, and talk to your local community about this, and we help train them in how to do that. I think the idea here is to build infrastructure to take coordinated political action, and to have like, so that you get past this sort of like modern movements often are sort of like a flash in the pan thing where you have like a bunch of people protest and then they all go home and like maybe they're still posting about it on social media, but they're not like, putting in the work regularly. So I think we need like real, serious organization here. And we also need to maintain, strong message discipline that this is about these societal scale risks, and this is not about like, a left-right politics. This is all like very uncertain. I really was thinking more about just, going on TV again, like I did a couple years ago more. But it's really about a month ago that I was like, actually, I think we need to do something like this as well. There are things like this to some extent already. So the Center for AI Safety that put out that statement, and the Future of Life Institute do things that are sort of like this, definitely on the comm side. On the actual movement building side, I think the main ones are Pause AI and Stop AI. And Pause AI is much bigger. Stop AI is more extreme. In fact, Stop AI, they blocked and locked the front door to OpenAI earlier this year and are going on trial for that, where they plan to defend their actions as necessary due to the emergency posed by OpenAI's activity. And that is all happening, next week at the soonest. Possibly it will be delayed. And I may be an expert witness at that trial. And there's a couple new players in this space, Alliance for Secure AI and Seismic Foundation. They're doing more like on the comm side of things. And MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, they're sort of like Eliezer Yudkowsky is one of the guys I said, kicked this whole thing off years ago, decades ago, really. They're putting out a book a week from today called If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. And I think this is going to be a big moment, sort of like this statement from the Center for AI Safety that's going to really bring this into the public conversation again in a big way. And they're sort of shifting. In the past, they tried to do more technical stuff, but they're shifting to do more of this kind of outreach as well. Not the movement building stuff, but just the comms. I think still most people in the space think that it's a bad idea to build a safety movement. Somebody recently put out a blog post about that. And most of the work is aiming at elites and policymakers, not at the public and not at the broader civil society. Those are things that I disagree with and hope to change. This is Guido from Stop AI, who's currently on a hunger strike right now, day 7 of it, outside of the Anthropic offices in downtown San Francisco, and is getting some high-profile media interviews about it. So this is, just an example of some of the things that people are starting to do already in this space. What you can do, well, you can do protest stuff as well. I would say my personal opinion is that you shouldn't inconvenience random people. At some point, Stop AI stopped traffic, and that's maybe not the best tactic. I know people in climate do that sometimes. I think like we're not at the point where we need to do that, but protesting is something I think just more people should try. But I also put a couple ideas here for how people can contribute, from a more sort of academic point of view, even though I think like there is just tons of important work to do and low-hanging fruit in terms of raising awareness and building a movement and stuff like that. That's why I'm focused on that. So I think, when it comes to disempowerment and these concerns about agents, we really want to understand these concepts better. We don't have like rigorous enough foundations for them. And I think they don't even have to be rigorous. I think there might be ideas about power from like social science that might be very relevant here, especially when we're talking about measuring gradual disempowerment in various ways. We don't really know how to do that at the moment, but we really want to. People are asking us, the authors of that paper, how to measure this. And we're trying to answer that question. If you have ideas, get in touch. There's all sorts of issues that arise when you have not just a single agent, but now multiple agents, which is, of course, the situation that we should expect. I won't go into the details too much there. There's governance questions. I just gave a very quick overview of AI policy, but there's all sorts of questions to sort out here. So like, can we actually imagine a positive future with more and more powerful AI in it? Like, what would that look like? What kind of institutions would we need? Can we have, some future where we have powerful AI systems, but people are still represented, and their interests are still represented? So I talked about like the scaling stuff. There's a lot of like forecasting that could be done here, using various economic modeling or other forecasting approaches. I think one thing that we're really lacking, and it's like just shocking to me when I think about it, is like indicators of AI risk, including things like gradual disempowerment. So I think if we can get the market to like be, making more predictions that are relevant to this, other than just like AI big, money in pot, that will be really useful. You know, if we can get something like an economic instrument that tracks the risk of mass unemployment at 10 years from now, you know, that might give people a wake-up call when they see how much people are willing to to bet on mass unemployment in 10 years. There's also just a very all sorts of detailed questions about what's happening with AI, what's going to happen with AI, like when we put it in this place, when we put it in that way, in that place, in education, in the legal system. And will this be good or bad? How can we make it more good or bad? How can we leverage new AI capabilities to do good things, including fixing some of the problems in existing social systems, and including helping coordinate to avoid some of the problems that I've talked about here from AI. And then I think there's tons of work that people, with backgrounds in psychology and related fields could do here as well, looking at some of the mental health implications and the possibility and propensity for manipulation by AI systems, and figuring out, if we're trying to tell AI systems what we want, how do we make sure that that's actually a reliable system and people aren't engaging in more and more falsification? Cool. I did go a little bit over time, so I won't say anything more. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to questions.